Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, seekers of knowledge and those who just came here for a nap, let me take you on yet another journey into the dusty corners of boring history for sleep. Tonight, the tale that might cradle you into slumber is about something festive, something supposedly joyous, yet so wrapped in rules, rituals, and traditions that you might yawn your way through the whole ordeal. I am talking about weddings in ancient Rome, a society that loved grandeur, spectacle, and ceremony in everything, even in the act of tying two lives together. Now, you may think of weddings as a time of romance, vows, and cake, but in Rome, it was far less about romance and far more about contracts, social order, family alliances, and making sure the gods were not offended. So let us lie back, adjust our pillows, and allow history to lull us to sleep as we examine what weddings were like in ancient Rome. First, we must remember that marriage in Rome was not usually a matter of love. Forget about passion-filled romances and starry-eyed couples. Instead, think about strategic alliances, family honor, property, and politics. A Roman wedding was less about two people joining their lives and more about two families securing their futures. Fathers often arranged marriages for their daughters, not out of care for their happiness, but to strengthen political ties or gain financial security. A marriage could seal a truce between feuding families, unite business interests, or elevate social status. Love was sometimes present, but it was never the main ingredient in the Roman recipe for marriage. For many young women, especially from noble or wealthy families, marriage was the duty they owed to their family, not a personal choice. The legal framework of Roman marriage was just as important as the rituals. Roman society was built on law, and even in the household, legal contracts defined roles and responsibilities. Two main types of marriage existed: cum manu and sine manu. In cum manu marriage, the wife passed completely into the authority of her husband. She left her father's household and legally became a member of her husband's family, almost like a daughter to him. In this arrangement, any property she owned transferred to her husband's control. On the other hand, in sine manu marriage, the wife remained under her father's legal authority, even while living with her husband. This allowed women of wealthier families to keep their property within their father's lineage and gave them a little more independence. Over time, the sine manu form became more common, as families realized the advantages of retaining control of property. So how did the Romans turn this legal framework into ceremony? Weddings were never casual affairs. The event was surrounded by elaborate rituals, many rooted in superstition and religion. Romans feared the wrath of the gods, and so every stage of life, birth, marriage, death, was soaked in ritual to win divine favor. A wedding was not merely about the bride and groom, it was about pleasing the household gods, ensuring fertility, and maintaining harmony between the human and divine worlds. The process of marriage began long before the actual wedding day. Betrothals, or sponsalia, were often arranged when the bride and groom were still children. Once an agreement was made between families, the engagement could be sealed with a symbolic gesture. The groom-to-be would give the bride a ring, often made of iron, worn on the third finger of the left hand, as the Romans believed a vein connected that finger directly to the heart. If that sounds familiar, it's because this ancient custom is the ancestor of our modern wedding ring tradition. The engagement was less about romance and more about the promise of future alliance. Though it carried binding force, breaking off an engagement could be a serious insult between families. Now let's picture the wedding day itself. Roman weddings were usually held in June, the month dedicated to the goddess Juno, protector of marriage and childbirth. Choosing the right day was crucial, because Romans were deeply superstitious. Some days were considered unlucky for weddings, such as the calends, nuns, and ides of each month, as well as the entire month of May, which was associated with rites for the dead. Once the day was chosen, the preparations began in earnest. The bride's attire was symbolic and carefully prescribed. She wore a white tunic, fastened with a belt tied in a special knot called the knot of Hercules, believed to ensure fertility and protection. The belt would later be untied by the groom on the wedding night. Over her tunic, she draped a saffron-colored veil called a flammeum, which covered her head and face, symbolizing modesty and the transition from maidenhood to wifehood. She also adorned her hair in a specific style, divided into 6 locks with the help of a spearhead or iron implement, a detail linking her to Rome's warrior traditions and emphasizing the seriousness of marriage as a civic duty. Flowers, garlands, and ribbons often completed the ensemble, but everything had ritual meaning, nothing was mere decoration. The ceremony began with sacrifices to the gods, particularly to Juno and Jupiter, to bless the union. A pig or sheep might be sacrificed, and the auspices were read by a priest to determine whether the gods favored the marriage. Bad omens could delay or even cancel the wedding. Once divine approval was secured, the bride and groom exchanged vows, a simple yet binding declaration of consent. The groom would say, "Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia, where you are Gaius, I am Gaia." This phrase, symbolic rather than literal, expressed the unity of the couple, no matter what their actual names were. Consent was the core of Roman marriage. Without it, the union had no legal standing. Witnesses were required at the ceremony, often at least 10, to ensure the marriage was valid and publicly recognized. Marriage in Rome was as much about public acknowledgement as it was about private commitment. After vows, the signing of a contract could follow, especially among elite families, to outline dowries and property arrangements. Dowries were an essential part of Roman marriage. A dowry was the property or money that a bride's family gave to the groom or his family to support the new household. The size of the dowry reflected the wealth and status of the families involved. It was a practical measure, ensuring the wife would be supported and the husband compensated for taking responsibility for her. After the formalities, the wedding feast began. Roman banquets were lively, filled with food, drink, and entertainment. Guests feasted on delicacies, wine flowed generously, and musicians or dancers might be hired to create a festive atmosphere. The feast was not only a celebration but also an opportunity for both families to display their wealth and status. In fact, sometimes the scale of the wedding banquet was as much about showing off as it was about honoring the couple. The most dramatic part of the ceremony came after the feast, the procession. In this ritual, the bride was led from her father's house to her new husband's home. This journey was full of symbolism and marked the true transfer of the bride from one family to another. Torches lit the path, musicians played, and friends and family shouted good wishes, or even jokes and teasing, to ward off evil spirits. The bride carried household items, such as a distaff and spindle, symbolizing her new role in managing the home and weaving the family's future. At the doorway of the groom's house, the bride was ceremonially lifted over the threshold. This was not merely a romantic gesture, it prevented her from stumbling, which would have been considered a bad omen. Once inside, she anointed the doorposts with oil and fat, a ritual to bless the household gods and ensure prosperity. The marriage was then consummated, usually on that same night. The bride, still wearing her symbolic attire, shared the bridal bed with her husband, completing the union in both a physical and social sense. Fertility was a central expectation of marriage, particularly for elite families who sought heirs to carry on their name and property. A Roman woman's success as a wife was often measured by her ability to bear children, especially sons. But let us not imagine that every Roman wedding was the same. Customs varied depending on social class. Wealthy patrician families held grand and extravagant ceremonies, with feasts that could rival political banquets, while ordinary plebeians had simpler weddings. In some cases, lower-class couples might skip the elaborate rituals altogether, living together as common law partners in a form known as usus, which allowed them to be considered married after cohabiting for a year without the wife spending 3 nights away. This form of marriage required no ceremony, no dowry, and no feast, making it accessible to those of lesser means. Over time, Roman weddings evolved, influenced by changes in law, culture, and the rise of Christianity. By the late Empire, Christian elements began to replace older pagan rituals, though many traditional features lingered. The emphasis on consent, the symbolism of rings, and even the lifting of the bride over the threshold survived into later European customs and remain recognizable in modern weddings. Yet, for all their symbolism and ritual, Roman weddings were not always fairy tales. Divorce was relatively easy and common in Rome. Either husband or wife could initiate divorce simply by declaring the intention, though the practical consequences often fell harder on women. Dowries could be reclaimed, reputations could be tarnished, and alliances could be broken. Marriage was both a personal union and a fragile social contract, subject to the shifting tides of politics, wealth, and fortune. So what do we make of all this? In the end, Roman weddings reveal much about Roman society itself. They show us a culture obsessed with law, ritual, and hierarchy, where personal feelings often took a back seat to public duty. They remind us that even something as intimate as marriage could be a stage for politics, family ambition, and religious observance. For the bride, the wedding marked not just the start of a partnership but the beginning of a new role, often one of duty, submission, and expectation. For the groom, it was both a social obligation and a source of honor, wealth, and family legacy. And for the gods, it was yet another occasion where mortals bent over backward to seek their approval. Now, as we drift deeper into the quiet rhythms of history, it is clear that Roman weddings, though filled with pomp, were not always filled with joy. They were ceremonies of order, duty, and continuity, less about the heart and more about the household, less about love and more about legacy. Yet, they have left echoes that still ring in the rituals we practice today. So as you close your eyes and let this boring history for sleep carry you away, imagine the saffron veil, the torchlit procession, the solemn vows whispered before witnesses, and know that even in their rigid order, the Romans were simply trying to bring meaning, order, and stability to the chaos of human life. And with that, my friends, our journey into the world of Roman weddings comes to a gentle end, an ending as ceremonial as the rituals themselves, and perhaps as sleep-inducing as the chanting of ancient prayers. May your dreams tonight be free of dowry contracts, toga-clad guests, and the knot of Hercules.